father was back and forth in jail, like he was locked up most of the time, and then he passed away.
Do you know what he went to jail for?
No, not exactly, no.
He was in jail for a while?
Yeah, like, I met him when I was like 8, 7 or something. He was in jail all while, you see what I'm saying?
In the dangerous streets of Chicago, where you either make it out or end up a pack, King Von and his family were not living the average American life. In fact, they were living a serious life of crime, which led up to how King Von was raised to become a damn serial killer at the very young age of 15. The Bennett family has a very interesting story. Walter Silk Bennett, the out-of-park savage who ruled Chicago's underworld, and his son David King Von Bennett, who turned childhood trauma into a killing spree that would make him both famous and dead by age 26. And it ain't stopping none. Ain't nothing we got to move. You me saying I got move. It's really just today we about to dive deep into the Bennett family tree and see how a father's murder created a monster. We're going to talk about Silk's rise to power in Chicago's most dangerous neighborhoods, his relationship with Van's mother, Tisa, and how their love story played out against the backdrop of gang wars and street politics. We're going to explore how Silk built his criminal empire from the ground up, the enemies he made along the way, and how his assassination by a sniper rifle set off a chain reaction that turned his son into a cold-blooded killer. We're going to break down how Van's mother couldn't control him after losing his father.
You think they looking at you stand, but they really fanned out. They on some, hey, you Von, good man, you going crazy.
How Van jumped off the porch early seeking revenge for a murder he witnessed as a child. And how that same street mentality that made him a legend eventually got him killed in Atlanta. We're going to talk about the specific people Von allegedly murdered, why he killed them, and how each body added to his reputation as Chicago's most dangerous young shooter. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how generational trauma and street politics created one of the most dangerous rappers to ever touch a microphone, and how his mom is now living lavish off the royalties from music that basically served as confessions to multiple murders.
What's your ID number?
Yeah, you are. I quit. What you fucking up like?
What's your ID number?
2014.
King Von, born David Doan Bennett on August 9, 1994, came into this world already marked by the streets. But to understand Van's story, we got to go further back to his parents and how they came together in the concrete jungle of Chicago's South Side, where love and violence danced together like partners in a deadly waltz. Van grew up in an area called Killer Ward, located on West 78th and South Hermitage. Now, this wasn't a regular neighborhood where kids played hopscotch and rode bikes. This was territory controlled by some of Chicago's most notorious gangs, mainly the Gangsta Disciples and the Black Peace Stones. The name Killer Ward wasn't just for show or some cool street nickname. This was a place where violence was as common as corner stores, where young kids learned to duck bullets before they learned to tie their shoes, where the sound of gunshots was the neighborhood's twisted lullaby. I don't think I'm at the highest point yet, but right now, like so far at this right now, right, yeah. That's the highest. Like this, the highest I've ever been. Van attended Barton Elementary School in the area. And even as a young kid walking to class with his backpack and lunch money, he was already being exposed to the gang politics that would eventually consume his life like a cancer. Teachers would see kids as young as 8 and 9 years old throwing up gang signs, talking about who got shot the night before, and learning how to survive in this crazy-ass city. But what really set Von apart from other kids in his situation was his bloodline. See, Von wasn't just another kid from the hood trying to survive. He was the son of a street legend, and that legacy would follow him everywhere he went. It was like Von had an image already painted for him that he had to live up to. The Bennett family name carried serious weight in Chicago's underworld. The kind of weight that opened doors, but also painted targets on bees. Van's father, Walter E. Bennett, known throughout the South Side as Silk, was already establishing himself as one of the most respected and feared figures in the Black Disciples organization.
I'm my favorite basketball player too, so. Von James.
Well, what about when Kobe passed? Did that affect you emotionally?
Yeah, that shit.
This wasn't some corner boy selling dime bags to high school kids. Silk was operating on a completely different level, moving serious weight and commanding respect from seasoned criminals who had been in the game for decades. And Van's mother, Tisa, was the woman who captured the heart of this street king during his rise to power. She wasn't some naive girl who didn't understand what she was getting into. Tata knew exactly what kind of man Silk was and what kind of life she was choosing when she decided to build a family with him. The environment Van was born into was one where violence was normalized. This was the foundation that would shape every decision Van made for the rest of his short life. Walter Bennett wasn't born into luxury or privilege. He was born into struggle on October 28, 1974. But the circumstances of his birth would give him his legendary nickname and set the tone for a life that would become the stuff of street folklore. According to family stories that have been passed down through generations of Chicago street legends, Walter was born at home on silk sheets. And from that moment, everyone called him Silk. It was like the universe was already marking him for something special. Silk grew up in Ada Park, another rough area on Chicago's South Side, and also known for getting spanked.
Like you need movement, go check in, go to the doctor or something, you go, little shit like that,
But this wasn't some suburban neighborhood where the biggest worry was keeping up with the Joneses. This was a damn war zone where every day was a test of your ability to navigate violence, poverty, and a constant threat of death or imprisonment. His biological father wasn't around much, probably locked up or dead like so many men in their community. But his stepfather, Big Reggie, was a major player in the game. Big Reggie wasn't just some small-time hustler trying to make ends meet. He was connected, respected, and feared throughout the South Side. He had the kind of reputation that made other criminals step aside when he walked down the street. The kind of influence that could make problems disappear or create new ones depending on his mood. Big Reggie became Silk's mentor, teaching him everything about the streets. How to move weight without attracting police attention. How to command respect without appearing weak. How to build a network of loyal associates. How to handle disputes without creating unnecessary enemies. And most importantly, how to survive in a world where one wrong move could get you killed or locked up for life. But Silk wasn't just another street soldier following orders and hoping to climb the ranks. Even as a young man, he showed the kind of intelligence and charisma that separates leaders from followers. The kind of natural ability that made people want to follow him into dangerous situations. He was a natural athlete.
Like, you know, it's the same shit. I just gotta move how I move and just gotta, shit, be ready, don't get ready. Shit, you better.
Don't get ready. So, you better be particularly gifted at basketball. And for a while, it looked like sports might be his ticket out of the hood and into a legitimate life. College scouts had started paying attention to Silk's skills on the court. And there were whispers about potential scholarships that could have changed the entire trajectory of his life. But the streets had other plans for Walter Bennett. And the immediate money and respect that came with criminal activity proved more attractive than the uncertain promise of athletic success. The thing about Silk was that he understood the game on a level that most people never reach, even those who spend their entire lives in the streets. He wasn't just about the violence, though he could handle himself when necessary and had proven his willingness to use force when diplomacy failed. Silk was a strategist who happened to operate outside the law and knew exactly what the heck he was doing. He learned early that in the streets, trust is a liability that can get you killed, but respect is everything that keeps you alive. And Silk commanded respect wherever he went, not just through fear and intimidation, but through his intelligence and his ability to make everyone around him more successful. So, is it like different gangs out there? The majority just be around. After spending nearly a decade behind bars on various charges, and we're going to get into his criminal record in detail later, Silk emerged from prison as a changed man. He wasn't just another ex-con trying to get back on his feet and hoping to avoid returning to custody. He was a man with a plan and the kind of street credibility that money can't buy and time can't erase. When Silk joined the Black Disciples, it wasn't some desperate attempt to find protection. It was a business partnership between equals. The BDS recognized Silk's value immediately, and together they built an empire that stretched across multiple neighborhoods and generated more money than most legitimate businesses. Now, let's talk about what made Silk a legend in these streets. Because this wasn't just some corner boy rookie selling dime bags to high school kids or some small-time hustler trying to make rent money. Silk was operating on a completely different level, running a sophisticated criminal organization that would have impressed law enforcement agencies and business schools alike if it had been legal. Silk's criminal record tells the story of a man who was serious about his business and willing to face the consequences of his choices. Multiple arrests for drug trafficking showed that he was moving serious weight. We're talking about kilograms of cocaine and heroin, not the small amounts that street-level dealers handle. Weapons charges indicated that he understood the importance of being prepared for violence in a business where disputes couldn't be settled in court. Assault charges revealed that Silk wasn't afraid to handle problems personally when necessary. But the relatively small number of violent charges compared to drug offenses showed that he preferred to use his intelligence rather than his fists whenever possible. "Yeah, I ain't got no more money. This all the money I own in my pocket, and then I'll get up. I need 2,500. This was a man who understood that unnecessary violence was bad for business and attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement. But what made Silk special wasn't just what was on paper. It was how he conducted himself in the streets and the respect he earned from both allies and enemies. See, in Chicago's gang politics, there's a difference between being feared and being respected. Any fool with a gun can make people afraid. But earning genuine respect requires intelligence, consistency, and the ability to keep your word even when it costs you. Silk had all of these qualities in abundance, plus the kind of natural charisma that made people want to work with him rather than against him. His operation wasn't just about moving drugs, though that was certainly a major part of it. Silk understood that real power in the streets comes from controlling territory, managing relationships, and building a network of loyal associates who trust your judgment and respect your leadership. He wasn't just a dealer. He was a CEO of a criminal enterprise that employed dozens of people and generated millions of dollars in revenue. His crew included lookouts who watched for police and rival gangs, runners who transported drugs and money, enforcers who handled security and collections, and lieutenants who managed day-to-day operations in different territories. The Black Disciples organization welcomed Silk with open arms because they recognized his value immediately. He brought intelligence, connections, and a level of professionalism that elevated everyone around him. Under his influence, their operations became more sophisticated, more profitable, and more sustainable than they had ever been before.
So I'm like, damn, what the fuck?
Yeah.
You know, but I'm in jail. I'm thinking about jail shit. We still young. We still gang banging. It's 2011.
Silk's success also made him a target because in the streets, there's always someone looking to take what you've built. Always someone who thinks they can do it better. Always someone who wants to make a name for themselves by taking down a legend. Silk understood this reality and prepared for it accordingly. But he also knew that paranoia could be just as dangerous as carelessness. His crew was carefully selected. Each member chosen for their loyalty, their skills, and their willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect the organization. Silk didn't just hire muscle. He built a family of associates who understood that their success was tied to his success and their survival depended on his survival. The money that flowed through Silk's operation was substantial. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars moving through his network on a regular basis. This wasn't just enough to live comfortably. This was generational wealth, the kind of money that could set up his children and their children for life if it was invested properly. But with that money came responsibility that most people couldn't handle. Silk had to manage relationships with suppliers who could cut off his product if they lost confidence in him, handle disputes between crew members without showing favoritism, deal with law enforcement pressure without compromising his organization, and constantly watch for signs of betrayal or weakness within his ranks. Now, every king needs a queen, and for Silk, that queen was Taisha. But this wasn't no fairy tale romance with happy endings and white picket fences. This was a love story that played out against the backdrop of Chicago's most dangerous streets, where passion and violence often went hand in hand, where loyalty was tested daily, and where love had to compete with a constant threat of death or imprisonment. Tisha was young, beautiful, and smart enough to understand the world she was entering. When she got involved with Silk, she wasn't some naive girl from the suburbs who didn't understand what her man did for a living or the dangers that came with being the woman of a street legend. Tisha had grown up in the same neighborhoods, seen the same violence, and understood the rules of the game better than most men who claimed to be players. But she was also drawn to the excitement, the lifestyle, and the undeniable charisma that made Silk one of the most sought-after men in their circle. When Silk walked into a room, people noticed. When he spoke, people listened. It really got to that point where you got to hurt somebody or somebody trying to hurt you and you got to protect yourself. When he made decisions, people followed. That kind of power and confidence was intoxicating, especially to a young woman who had grown up seeing too many weak men who couldn't protect themselves, let alone their families. Their relationship was intense from the beginning. The kind of passionate connection that burns hot and fast, but also has the potential to consume everything in its path. Silk was a man who commanded respect in the streets, who made life and death decisions on a daily basis, who carried the weight of his organization's success on his shoulders. But with Taisha, he could let his guard down and be vulnerable in ways that would have been dangerous with anyone else. She saw sides of him that his enemies and even his closest associates never witnessed. Behind closed doors, away from the politics and violence of street life, Silk was just Walter. A man who wanted to build something lasting with the woman he loved, who dreamed of a future where his children wouldn't have to live the same dangerous life he had chosen. But loving a street legend comes with its own set of challenges that most people can't imagine. Silk's lifestyle meant he was constantly in motion, constantly looking over his shoulder, constantly preparing for the next threat. There were nights when Tisha didn't know if he was coming home. Days when she had to wonder if that knock on the door was the police with a warrant or something much worse. The stress of living with that kind of uncertainty would have broken most relationships. But Taisha was stronger than most women. She understood that the same qualities that made Silk dangerous in the streets, his intelligence, his loyalty, his willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect what was his, also made him a man worth standing by. It seemed like nothing really in Chicago. Too much going on. I was out of town. Despite these challenges, their love was real and it was strong enough to create a family together. Silk and Tisa had multiple children, with Devon being one of the youngest. Each child represented hope for the future, but also another person who could be affected by the dangerous life Silk had chosen. Another potential target for his enemies. Another reason to be careful, but also another motivation to be successful. The thing about Silk and Tata's relationship was that it existed in two worlds simultaneously. In public, they were the king and queen of their neighborhood, respected, feared, and envied by many. People looked up to them as an example of what success in the streets could look like. How a man could provide for his family and command respect at the same time. But in private, they were just two people trying to build a life together while navigating the constant threats that came with Silk's position in the criminal hierarchy. Taisha knew that Silk's activities put their entire family at risk. But she also understood that this was the only life he knew, the only way he knew how to provide for them and protect them from the poverty that had defined both of their childhoods. She watched him build his empire, saw the respect he commanded from men who had been in the game for decades, and witnessed firsthand the loyalty he inspired in his crew. But she also lived with a constant fear that one day his enemies would find a way to reach him, that his luck would run out, that the violence that had made him powerful would eventually consume him. 060-8061. They know you be threatening people. Tell me what happened on 3B. You came and got me on my seat. That's it. Their home life was complicated by Silk's frequent absences. Whether he was handling business in the streets, meeting with associates to plan new operations, or serving time in jail for various charges, Silk's presence in their children's daily lives was inconsistent. This meant that Taisha often found herself playing both mother and father, trying to maintain stability for their kids while their father built his legend in the streets. The Bennett household was unlike most families, even in their rough neighborhood. While other kids were worried about homework and chores, Vaughn and his siblings were growing up in a house where their father's business associates came and went at all hours, where conversations about territory and rivals were as common as discussions about dinner plans, where the sound of police sirens wasn't just background noise, but a potential threat to their family's stability. Taisha did her best to create some sense of normalcy for their children, but it was impossible to completely shield them from the reality of their father's lifestyle. Van was smart enough to understand that his father was different from other dads. That the respect people showed Silk wasn't just because he was friendly or successful in some conventional way. Even as a young child, Vaughn could see the way people reacted when Silk walked into a room. Conversations would stop. People would straighten up and everyone would wait to see what the king of Ada Park had to say. All right.
you know, I'll be having the beers and shit. Like this jail shit been coming a lot. So I wrote a lot of shit. You know, in jail, you just...
Interview 18:16/1820. This wasn't fear. Exactly. It was the kind of respect that comes from knowing you're in the presence of someone who has real power, someone who could change your life for better or worse with a single decision. Silk tried to be a good father when he was around, teaching his children about loyalty, respect, and the importance of family, but his lessons were filtered through the lens of street life, where these concepts had different meanings than they did in the conventional world. Loyalty meant being willing to die for your crew. Respect meant being feared as much as loved. Family meant protecting your blood by any means necessary, even if it meant destroying someone else's family. You know, I already jumped to the conclusion I'm, going to be an underscore or mean, or the money that flowed through their household was substantial, but it came with strings attached that most families never have to consider. Every dollar was earned through activities that could result in prison time or death. Every luxury they enjoyed was paid for with risks that most people couldn't imagine taking. Van's siblings each reacted differently to their unusual upbringing. Some tried to distance themselves from their father's lifestyle, focusing on school and conventional activities. Others were drawn to the excitement and respect that came with being Silk's children. But Van was different from all of them. He seemed to absorb every lesson about street life like a sponge, storing away information that would later shape his own approach to the game. Tisha watched her youngest son with growing concern as he showed more and more interest in his father's world. She could see the intelligence in Van's eyes, the way he processed information and asked questions that showed he understood more than a child his age should. She tried to steer him toward other interests, but the pull of the streets was strong, especially for a boy who idolized his father. The family dynamics were further complicated by Silk's frequent trips to jail. When he was locked up, Tessa had to manage everything alone. The household, the children, and the financial pressures that came with supporting a family without their primary breadwinner. These periods of separation were hard on everyone, but they were especially difficult for Vaughn, who missed his father intensely and counted down the days until his release. During Silk's absences, Vaughn would often ask his mother questions about his father's business, trying to understand why Silk had to go away and when he would be coming back. Tisha did her best to explain things in age-appropriate ways, but how do you tell a child that their father is in prison for selling drugs or carrying weapons without making it sound either glamorous or shameful? The neighborhood where they lived provided constant reminders of the life Silk had chosen. Van would see other kids whose fathers had been killed or locked up for long stretches, families that had been torn apart by violence or incarceration, women who were struggling to raise children alone because their men had chosen the streets over stability. That's when I first saw it that day. And what did you say nothing to her that day? But Vaughn also saw the respect that came with his father's position. The way people treated the Bennett family differently because of Silk's reputation. Store owners would give them credit when money was tight. Other families would ask for Silk's help when they had problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. Police officers who knew Silk's reputation would sometimes look the other way when his children got into minor trouble. This dual reality, the dangers and the benefits of being Silk's son, created a complex worldview in Van's developing mind. He understood that his father's lifestyle was dangerous, but he also saw how it provided for their family and commanded respect from everyone around them. The lessons he learned during these formative years would stay with him for the rest of his life. But every king's reign eventually comes to an end. And for Silk, that end came suddenly and violently on July 31st, 2005. It was a Sunday, the kind of day that should have been peaceful, reserved for family time and relaxation. But in Chicago streets, peace is always temporary, and even legends aren't immune to the violence that defines their world. Silk was outside the skating rink on 87th Street, a place he'd been to countless times before. This was familiar territory, a spot where he felt comfortable and secure, where he had friends and allies who would watch his back. The skating rink was a popular hangout spot for people from their neighborhood, a place where families could have fun and young people could socialize without the constant tension that defined other areas. But comfort can be dangerous in the streets, and familiarity can breed the kind of complacency that gets you killed. Silk had survived in a dangerous world for years by being constantly alert, always watching for threats, never letting his guard down completely. But on this particular Sunday, something was different. Maybe he was tired from years of looking over his shoulder. Maybe he thought his reputation would protect him. Maybe he just wanted one afternoon where he could relax and enjoy himself without worrying about enemies and rivals. According to Van's uncle, who spoke about the incident years later in interviews that would eventually surface online, Silk was targeted by a sniper. Now, this wasn't no random drive-by shooting or heat violence between rivals who happened to cross paths. This was a calculated professional hit carried out with military precision and planning that suggested serious resources and connections. The shooter was positioned at a distance, probably in one of the nearby housing projects where snipers used to pick off targets from the towers. The high-rise buildings that dominated Chicago's south side provided perfect vantage points for this kind of assassination, allowing shooters to take out targets from hundreds of yards away while remaining hidden and having multiple escape routes. The use of a sniper rifle tells us several important things about Silk's murder that help explain why it happened and who might have been responsible. First, this was planned well in advance. Someone had been watching Silk's movements, studying his patterns, learning his habits, and waiting for the perfect opportunity. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. This was a professional execution. Second, the person or people behind this hit had serious resources and connections. Sniper rifles aren't easy to come by on the street. And the skill required to make that kind of shot suggests either military training or extensive experience with long-range shooting. This wasn't some young gangbanger with a handgun. This was someone who knew what they were doing and had access to professional-grade equipment. Third, the choice to use a sniper rather than a more conventional assassination method suggests that the killers wanted to send a message. They could have waited for Silk to be alone and shot him at close range. Or they could have used a car bomb or some other method. But they chose to kill him in a way that demonstrated their reach, their patience, and their ability to strike from a distance. But why would someone want Silk dead badly enough to go to these lengths? The streets are full of rumors and theories, but the most credible explanation involves a violation of trust that couldn't be forgiven or forgotten. In the world Silk operated in, your word is your bond. And breaking that bond can be a death sentence. Word on the street was that Silk had crossed the wrong person, taken something that wasn't his, or broken a promise that had serious consequences. So far this year, the GBI has investigated 82 officer-involved shootings statewide, 11 involving Atlanta police. The exact details of what Silk allegedly did may never be known, but the response was swift and final. In Chicago's criminal underworld, there are certain lines that can't be crossed, certain rules that can't be broken, certain debts that can only be paid with blood. The thing about street justice is that it's not always immediate. Sometimes people wait months or even years for the right opportunity to settle a score. They watch, they plan, they gather intelligence, and they strike when their target is most vulnerable. That's exactly what happened to Silk. His enemies played the long game, waiting for the perfect moment to take their revenge. In Chicago, it happened again last night. Kids shooting kids. On that Sunday afternoon, as Silk stood outside the skating rink, probably thinking about his family, his business, or his future plans, a sniper's bullet ended his life instantly. There was no warning, no chance to defend himself, no opportunity to negotiate or explain. One moment he was alive, and the next moment he was gone, leaving behind a legacy written in blood and a family that would never be the same. The impact of Silk's death rippled through Chicago's underworld immediately, like a stone thrown into still water. A man of his stature doesn't just disappear without consequences that affect everyone who knew him, worked with him, or considered him an enemy. The assassination of a street legend creates a power vacuum that other players rush to fill, often leading to more violence as different factions try to claim his territory and assets. But he's just like Vaughn. Big heart. If he push you, you got a big heart. If we got $10,000, it's me and you, we got 5. Silk's crew was left without their leader, the man who had provided direction, protection, and financial opportunities for dozens of people. Some of his associates tried to keep the organization running, but without Silk's intelligence and connections, the operation began to fall apart. Suppliers lost confidence. Rivals sensed weakness, and law enforcement saw an opportunity to dismantle what remained of his empire. His family was left without their provider and protector, suddenly vulnerable in ways they had never experienced before. The money that had flowed so freely when Silk was alive dried up almost overnight. The protection that came with being Silk's family disappeared, leaving them exposed to his enemies and to the general violence that plagued their neighborhood. But perhaps the most significant impact was on his children, particularly his youngest son, Devon. At just 11 years old, Vaughn lost the man he looked up to, the father whose name commanded respect throughout their neighborhood, the legend whose footsteps he was already beginning to follow. The psychological trauma of losing a parent to violence at such a young age cannot be overstated. For Vaughn, his father's murder wasn't just a personal loss. It was a lesson about how the world works, about the price of power, and about the reality that even kings can fall. Just like Van, big heart. If you fool, you got a big heart. If we got $10,000, this me and you, we got 5. You know what I'm saying? That's how he moved. But you don't want to see him though. He a demon. The image of his father as an invincible street legend was shattered in an instant, replaced by the harsh reality that violence could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. Van later rapped about how he couldn't sleep after his father's death. How the trauma of that loss haunted him and changed the trajectory of his entire life. In his music, he would describe lying awake at night, thinking about his father's murder, wondering who was responsible, and planning his own entry into the streets that had claimed Silk's life. The funeral was a massive event that brought together hundreds of people from across Chicago's South Side. Street legends, gang members, family, friends, and community members all came to pay their respects to a man who had been larger than life. But even in death, Silk's presence was controversial. Some saw him as a pillar of the community who had provided for his family and protected his neighborhood, while others viewed him as a criminal whose lifestyle had brought violence and instability to their area. Taisha found herself in an impossible situation. She was suddenly a single mother with multiple children to raise and no steady income. The money that had supported their lifestyle was gone, and she had no legal way to replace it. She had to find work immediately, often taking multiple jobs just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. This meant long hours away from home, leaving Van and his siblings to essentially raise themselves during the most critical years of their development. That's like my flow, that's the flow I make when I don't got no beat. You see what I'm saying? For Van, his mother's absence due to work created a void that the streets were eager to fill. Without proper supervision or guidance, he began gravitating toward the same corners and crews that had shaped his father's life. The psychological impact of losing his father in such a violent way cannot be understated. Van didn't just lose a parent. He lost his protector, his role model, and his connection to the power and respect that the Bennett name had commanded. In his young mind, the only way to reclaim that legacy was to prove himself in the same streets that had claimed his father's life. Friends and family members who knew Vaughn before his father's death would later say that the murder changed him completely. The happy, playful child they remembered was replaced by someone harder and more focused on the violence that surrounded them. It was as if Silk's death had awakened something dark in Vaughn that would only grow stronger as he got older. Some people treated Van with extra kindness, feeling sorry for the boy who had lost his father so young. Others kept their distance, worried that associating with Silk's family might make them targets as well. By the time Van reached his teenage years, the sweet kid who had lost his father to street violence had transformed into something much darker and more dangerous. The trauma of Silk's murder, combined with his mother's inability to provide constant supervision, had created the perfect conditions for Van to become one of Chicago's most dangerous young killers. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that began with small acts of rebellion and escalated into serious criminal behavior. Van started skipping school regularly, hanging out with older kids who were already involved in gang activities, and learning the codes and customs that governed street life in their neighborhood. By 4th grade, according to Van's own later admissions, he was already getting involved in street politics. This wasn't normal childhood misbehavior. This was a traumatized child seeking to fill the void left by his father's murder. That was a diss. He started hanging around older kids from Killer Ward, learning the unwritten rules that govern their world and absorbing lessons about loyalty, respect, and violence. Van's first serious involvement in gang politics came when he was just 12 years old in 2006. He initially affiliated with a local crew called Killer Ward, which was connected to the Gangster Disciples. But his father's legacy with the Black Disciples eventually pulled him in that direction, and Vaughn would spend the rest of his life representing the BD organization that had welcomed his father. The transition from Killer Ward to Parkway Gardens, later known as O'Block, was crucial in Van's development as a street figure. Parkway Gardens was notorious throughout Chicago as one of the most dangerous housing developments in the city. A place where violence was so common that residents had learned to sleep on the floor to avoid stray bullets. It was here that Vaughn met the people who would become his closest associates and partners in violence. Names like Troy White, Big A, J Money, and countless others became Van's new family. These weren't just friends. They were soldiers in a war that had been going on for generations. A conflict that consumed young lives with ruthless efficiency for Vaughn, who was still processing the trauma of his father's murder. This brotherhood provided the sense of belonging and purpose that had been missing since Silk's death. But it also provided something else, an outlet for the rage and desire for revenge that had been building inside him since he was 11 years old. Van's involvement in street politics wasn't just about belonging. It was about revenge. In his mind, the same forces that had killed his father were still out there, still threatening his family and his neighborhood. The only way to honor Silk's memory and protect what was left of the Bennett legacy was to become even more dangerous than his father had been. The first major turning point in Van's transformation came on his 18th birthday, August 9, 2012. Van was out with his close friend White when they stopped at a convenience store on East 63rd Street and South Martin Luther King Drive. Van went inside to buy something, while White waited outside by the car. When Vaughn came back out, he found his friend shot and dying in the street. A gunman had pulled up and shot White in the back with a police officer on the scene, even returning fire and hitting the shooter, who ultimately managed to escape. White was pronounced dead in the early hours of August 9th, Van's birthday. This incident broke something inside Van that had already been damaged by his father's murder. In his song Demon, Van later rapped about how witnessing White's death on his birthday turned him into a completely different person. The pain, rage, and desire for revenge that had been building since his father's death finally found an outlet. Okay, you see what I'm saying? But the beat ain't no beat. That, _ getting that. Damn. But so do you have any ability to sort of tell where that came from? Because it's such a different. What happened next was a killing spree that would make Van one of the most feared names in Chicago's gang wars. Between 2012 and 2014, Vaughn was allegedly connected to multiple murders, each one more brazen than the last. The names of his alleged victims, Model P5, Boss Trill, Lil James, Malcolm Stuckey, became part of Chicago's grim statistics of young lives lost to street violence. But Van's approach to killing was different from typical gang violence. He didn't just shoot people and disappear. He celebrated his murders on social media, dropped hints in his music, and took pride in his body count like it was a video game score. This behavior suggests something deeper than simple gang warfare. It suggests the psychology of someone who derived genuine pleasure from taking lives. The pattern of Van's alleged murders shows a level of calculation and premeditation that goes beyond heat-of-the-moment violence. He would stalk his targets, study their movements, and strike when they were most vulnerable. Then he would tweet about it, sometimes within minutes of pulling the trigger, as if he wanted the world to know what he had done. The first murder that Vaughn was allegedly connected to took place on April 28, 2012, when a group of 4 men caught a man called King Doc walking into a convenience store. Doc, whose real name was Marlon Monroe, was shot as he entered the store and stumbled into a patch of tall weeds where he would pass away and lay undiscovered for hours. Doc would eventually be found dead by his 16-year-old cousin Modell, who was devastated by the discovery. Doc was remembered as an original member of the St. Lawrence and Eberhart area, and his affiliation with that territory likely made him a target for shooters from O'Block, even though he had apparently left the gang life behind and was working as a painter to support himself. The psychological impact on Modell of finding his cousin's body cannot be understated. The young man was traumatized by the experience and began getting more involved in gang activities himself, hanging around with people like Kai and FBG Duck and being seen on social media with weapons. It was a perfect example of how violence creates cycles that consume entire families and communities. Van's alleged involvement in this murder marked the beginning of his transformation from a grieving son into a cold-blooded killer. The death of Doc wasn't just another casualty in Chicago's gang wars. It was Van's first step into a world where taking lives became as routine as going to work. But it was the murder of Mel himself, just 6 months later, that really established Van's reputation as someone to be feared. On October 13, 2012, Mel was walking down the street with another cousin when someone approached them on foot and opened fire. Model was shot in the chest and later pronounced dead in the hospital. What made this murder particularly significant was Van's behavior on social media immediately afterward. Police documents that were released years later revealed that King Von himself was positively identified by a witness as the shooter, with Troy apparently at the scene as well. This meant that Vaughn was the prime suspect in the murder of the same young man who had discovered his cousin's body just months earlier. But even more incriminating was Van's Twitter activity immediately after the killing. Mel was shot around 9:30 p.m. and Vaughn tweeted, "Who died about 17 minutes after the murder took place." That tweet was followed by another one reading, "It's not safe around our way," which came less than an hour after the shooting. This pattern of tweeting immediately after alleged murders would become Van's signature throughout his killing spree. It was as if he couldn't resist the urge to let the world know what he had done, to claim credit for his crimes, even when doing so put him at risk of being caught by law enforcement. The day after Mel's murder, Van would tweet that him and Troy have a problem and that they can't stop doing their thingy thing. A reference to drilling or killing that Vaughn used regularly throughout his social media posts. Do the same thing. No. Yeah, they got to move all the guns down to just start beat ass. He would also tweet that the streets are in trouble when he's coming, showing the kind of arrogance and confidence that comes from getting away with murder. Only 2 days after the killing, Vaughn would get into an argument on Twitter with a well-known rival named Wooey, who had inferred that he had been out looking to catch Vaughn that day. Van's response was heartless. He said that he was getting t-shirts made for Model's funeral, mocking the death of someone he had allegedly just killed. This kind of behavior shows a level of psychological detachment that goes beyond normal gang violence. Most people who kill in the heat of the moment feel some level of remorse or at least try to distance themselves from their crimes. But Van seemed to take pleasure in taunting his victims' friends and family members, treating murder like a game where the goal was to cause as much pain as possible. The murder of Modell was followed by several other killings that Vaughn was allegedly connected to, each one adding to his reputation as one of O'Block's most dangerous shooters. P5, also known as Crack, was shot multiple times in November 2012. Boss Trill was found with a gunshot wound to the head and pronounced dead after fighting for his life in the hospital. Each murder was followed by the same pattern of social media activity from Vaughn. Cryptic tweets that seemed to claim responsibility, mocking posts about his victims, and celebrations of his crew's success in the ongoing gang war. It was as if Vaughn had turned killing into a form of entertainment, both for himself and for his followers on social media. The psychological profile that emerges from Van's alleged crimes during this period is consistent with serial killer behavior. He killed multiple people over extended periods. He took trophies in the form of social media posts and later song lyrics. And he derived psychological gratification from the fear and respect his actions generated. But perhaps most disturbing was Van's apparent inability to feel empathy for his victims or their families. When he tweeted about getting t-shirts made for Model's funeral, he wasn't just being disrespectful. He was showing a complete lack of human compassion that suggests serious psychological problems. Despite being connected to multiple murders and leaving a trail of incriminating social media posts, Van's ability to avoid serious legal consequences was almost supernatural and has to be studied. Time and time again, he would be arrested, questioned, and released, leading him to believe that he was untouchable and that the system couldn't hold him accountable for his actions. Like, how was this dude whacking and getting away with it? Van's first major arrest came in August 2010 when he was just 16 years old. Tell the uncle you told me you just came to visit. They come visit, I guess. He was charged with armed robbery for allegedly robbing someone for their car at gunpoint. Something he would later reference in his song Armed and Dangerous, saying that he was arrested on August 11th, 2 days after his 17th birthday, when he was offered a plea deal of 21 to 45 years in prison. Vaughn chose to fight the case rather than accept what would have been a life sentence. Instead of taking the plea, Vaughn ended up in boot camp, an intense military-style juvenile program that was supposed to rehabilitate young offenders and teach them discipline and respect for authority. But rather than learning these lessons, Vaughn seemed to use his time in the system to network with other young criminals and further develop his street credibility. After his release from boot camp, Vaughn was only free for a few months before catching another case in January 2011. This time he spent 15 months behind bars as a juvenile from December 2010 to March 2012. During this time, his friend Troy would tweet regularly calling for Van's release, showing the loyalty and brotherhood that existed within their crew. But it was after Van's release in March 2012 that his alleged killing spree really began. The combination of his father's murder, his friend's death, and his experiences in the juvenile system had created a perfect storm of rage and violence that would consume the next several years of his life. Throughout 2012 and 2013, as Vaughn was allegedly committing multiple murders, he was also being arrested regularly on smaller charges: weapons possession, battery, trespassing, and other offenses that showed he was constantly in trouble with the law. But somehow none of these arrests led to serious consequences. And Van always seemed to find a way to beat the charges or get released with minimal punishment. My mom is, I ain't gave her too much to say she proud of me about, but this right here, this make, it's decent. The most significant legal case Vaughn faced was the 2014 murder of Malcolm Stuckey. This wasn't a gang-related killing. Malcolm was an innocent victim who was in the wrong place at the wrong time when Vaughn allegedly opened fire at a birthday party. 3 people were shot, but only Malcolm died, and he wasn't even Van's intended target. The circumstances of Malcolm's murder were particularly tragic. Van had attended a birthday party where he spotted 2 members from a rival gang. The mother of the person whose birthday it was apparently told Vaughn not to start trouble in her house, and Van said that he wouldn't and left. But instead of going home, Van went and got his friend, Big Mike, and returned to the party with weapons. Van and Big Mike parked down the street and approached a group of 3 men outside the house, opening fire and hitting all 3. Vaughn allegedly chased the fleeing victims while yelling, "Why are you running?" showing the kind of predatory behavior that characterized his approach to violence. When Vaughn was finally arrested for Malcolm's murder in July 2014, it looked like his luck had finally run out. The evidence seemed solid. Witnesses had identified him. His accomplice was cooperating with police, and prosecutors were confident they could secure a conviction. Vaughn would spend the next 3.5 years in jail awaiting trial from June 2014 to December 2017. But even behind bars, Van's reputation continued to grow. He was involved in multiple fights with rival gang members who were also incarcerated, helped start a fire on his wing, and earned the nickname Grandson for his resemblance to Black Disciples founder David Barksdale. Prison didn't rehabilitate Vaughn. It just gave him more credibility and more connections within the criminal underworld. The trial for Malcolm Stuckey's murder should have been straightforward, but a series of events worked in Van's favor that seemed almost too convenient to be coincidental. The key witness who had identified Vaughn as the shooter failed to appear in court to testify. Van's co-defendant, Big Mike, initially agreed to cooperate with prosecutors and implicate Vaughn in the murder, but then backed out of the deal at the last minute. That whole day was sad. I ain't going to lie. Yeah, that's just a sad day. I ain't even get on Instagram or Twitter, none of that, __. Yeah, that was a sad day for I think he got the rain in Atlanta. Without solid testimony linking Vaughn to the murder, prosecutors couldn't meet the burden of proof required for a conviction. In December 2017, Vaughn was acquitted of all charges and walked out of jail a free man. The family of Malcolm Stuckey was devastated knowing that their loved one's killer was walking free while they would never see justice for his death. For Vaughn, this acquit was confirmation that he was untouchable, that the system couldn't hold him accountable no matter what he did. He had beaten a murder case with overwhelming evidence against him, and he walked out of jail more confident than ever that he could continue killing without facing serious consequences. This pattern of avoiding consequences would repeat itself throughout Van's life. Even when he was clearly guilty, even when evidence pointed directly to him, something would always go wrong. With the prosecution's case, witnesses would disappear, co-defendants would refuse to testify, and Vaughn would walk free to kill again. When Vaughn walked out of jail in December 2017, he had no intention of becoming a rapper. His plan was simple and straightforward. Get back to the streets, make some quick money through the same criminal activities that had sustained him before his arrest, and continue the lifestyle that had made him a legend in Chicago. He even talked about how he wanted to come home and start going around Lil Durk and rob his rapper friends cause he sees them as goofies. No, really, I'm cool, laid back. I ain't got a problem, nobody else got a problem with me or the __ moving forward like the view people have on me, like it's going to be some that. But his childhood friend Lil Durk had other plans that would change the trajectory of Van's life completely. Durk had watched Van's reputation grow during his time in prison and recognized that his friend's story could translate into rap success in ways that most artists could only dream of. The authenticity that Vaughn brought to the table was something that couldn't be manufactured, faked, or replicated. He had really lived everything that other rappers only pretended to experience in their music. Initially, Van was skeptical about the music industry and had no interest in pursuing a career as a rapper. He had tweeted years earlier that if he ever started rapping, people should kill the person closest to them because something wasn't right. This wasn't just a joke. Van genuinely believed that his reputation as a killer was more valuable than any potential success in the music business. But Durk was persistent and eventually convinced Vaughn to at least try recording a song to see how it would be received. The first track Vaughn recorded was Beat That Body with THF Bazoo, another Chicago rapper who had beaten a murder case. The song was literally about their shared experience of being charged with murder and walking free, with lyrics so explicit and self-incriminating that it's hard to believe they were allowed to be released. The title, Beat That Body, was street slang for beating a murder charge, and the entire song was essentially a celebration of getting away with killing someone. Van rapped about catching bodies, beating cases, and living in the streets with a level of detail and authenticity that immediately set him apart from other drill rappers who were often exaggerating or completely fabricating their criminal backgrounds. But that authenticity was exactly what made Van's music so compelling to listeners who were hungry for real stories from the streets. When he rapped about catching bodies, beating cases, and living in constant danger, listeners knew he wasn't making it up. Every bar was backed by real experiences, real trauma, and real consequences that most people could only imagine. Van's breakthrough came with Crazy Story, a narrative rap that told the story of a robbery gone wrong. The song showcased Van's natural storytelling ability and his talent for painting vivid pictures with his lyrics, taking listeners on a journey through a criminal plot that felt like watching a movie. The music video for Crazy Story was filmed in Van's neighborhood and featured him playing the main character in his own story. When the video dropped on World Star, it quickly went viral, racking up millions of views and establishing Vaughn as one of drill rap's most promising new artists. The success was almost immediate and overwhelming. The appeal of Crazy Story went beyond just the Chicago drill scene. It attracted listeners from all over the country who were fascinated by Van's ability to tell complete stories in his songs. This wasn't just bragging about violence or throwing around empty threats. This was sophisticated storytelling that happened to involve criminal activities. The success of Crazy Story opened doors that Vaughn had never imagined possible. He was invited to perform on major stages, collaborate with established artists, and sign lucrative record deals with major labels. For someone who had spent most of his life expecting to die young or spend life in prison, this level of success was almost surreal. But even as Vaughn's rap career took off, he couldn't completely leave the streets behind. His lyrics continued to reference his alleged murders, his social media posts still hinted at ongoing criminal activity, and his associates were still actively involved in Chicago's gang wars. The tension between his growing fame and his street credibility created a unique dynamic in his music. Songs like Took Her to the O, War With Us, and Don't Want to Be Me were essentially confessions set to music. Van would rap about specific murders, mention victims by name, and provide details that only the killer would know. It was as if he was daring law enforcement to arrest him, confident that his previous escapes from justice made him untouchable. The irony of Van's rap success is that it was built entirely on the trauma and violence that had destroyed so many lives, including his own. The same experiences that had turned him into a killer were now making him rich and famous. But success couldn't heal the psychological wounds that had been festering since his father's murder, and it couldn't change the fundamental mindset that saw violence as the solution to every problem. Van's music videos often featured his friends from a block, many of whom were still actively involved in gang activities. He would buy them expensive jewelry, take them on trips, and essentially use his rap money to fund their continued involvement in street politics. This blurred the lines between entertainment and real criminal activity in ways that would eventually attract federal attention. Even as Van's bank account grew and his fame spread beyond Chicago, the street mentality that had been ingrained in him since childhood remained completely unchanged. Money, success, and opportunities that most people could only dream of weren't enough to overcome the psychological programming that had been installed by years of trauma and violence. The most telling example of Van's unchanged mindset came in February 2019, when he and Lil Durk were allegedly involved in a shooting outside the Varsity restaurant in Atlanta. According to police reports and court documents, the two rappers and their associates shot and robbed a man named Alexander Weatherspoon, taking $30,000 in cash and his vehicle in broad daylight. Think about the complete insanity of this situation for a moment. Vaughn was a successful rapper with millions of dollars in the bank, a growing fan base around the world, and unlimited potential for legitimate success. He had everything that most people from his background could only dream of achieving. But when he saw an opportunity to rob someone, he couldn't resist the temptation. The thrill of the crime, the rush of violence, and the satisfaction of taking what belonged to someone else were more appealing to Vaughn than protecting his career and freedom. This wasn't about money. Van had more money than he could spend. This wasn't about survival. Van was living comfortably and safely. This was about the psychological satisfaction that came from committing violent crimes. The Atlanta shooting case showed that Van's success hadn't changed his fundamental nature. He was still the same person who had allegedly killed multiple people in Chicago, still driven by the same impulses and desires that had made him dangerous in the first place. The only difference was that now he had more to lose. But that didn't seem to matter to him. When Vaughn and Durk were arrested for the Atlanta shooting, it should have been a wake-up call that forced them to reevaluate their priorities and make better decisions. They were facing serious charges, including attempted murder, and the evidence against them seemed solid. But even while out on bond and facing potential life sentences, Van continued to make music that referenced his criminal activities. Perhaps the most disturbing example of Van's continued involvement in street politics was the alleged murder of FBG Duck in August 2020. Duck was a rival rapper who had been feuding with Vaughn and his associates for years. But by 2020, both men were successful artists with everything to live for and no rational reason to continue their conflict. According to federal investigators, who would later charge 5 of Van's associates with Duck's murder, Van put up a $100,000 bounty on Duck's head and coordinated the hit that killed him in broad daylight in Chicago's Gold Coast shopping district. This wasn't about territory, survival, or even business. This was about settling a personal grudge that had been festering for nearly a decade. The fact that Vaughn allegedly spent $100,000 of his rap money to have Duck killed shows how deeply the street mentality was embedded in his psyche. He had achieved everything that most people from his background could only dream of: wealth, fame, respect, and opportunities. But none of it was enough to satisfy the bloodlust that had been growing since his father's murder. Van's continued involvement in violence, while at the height of his success, demonstrates the psychological profile of someone who killed for pleasure rather than necessity. He didn't need to prove himself anymore. Didn't need money. Didn't need respect. He had all of those things. But he still needed to kill. Still needed to feel the power that came from taking lives and getting away with it. Vaughn would continue to reference his alleged murders in his music, posting cryptic messages on social media that seemed to take credit for various killings and maintaining his connections to active gang members who were still committing crimes in Chicago. He seemed unable or unwilling to separate his legitimate career from his criminal activities. The federal investigation into FBG Duck's murder would eventually reveal the extent of Van's continued involvement in street politics. Phone records, financial transactions, and surveillance footage would show that Vaughn had maintained his position as a leader and financier of criminal activities even while achieving mainstream success as a rapper. The beef that would ultimately cost Vaughn his life had nothing to do with Chicago gang politics or the street wars that had defined his existence for over a decade. Instead, it was a petty dispute over women that escalated into a deadly confrontation in Atlanta, proving that Van's violent tendencies extended far beyond his hometown conflicts and had become an integral part of his personality. The feud began with Van's relationship with Asian Doll, a female rapper who had become his girlfriend during his rise to fame. Their relationship was passionate but turbulent, marked by public displays of affection, followed by equally public breakups and reconciliations that played out on social media for millions of followers to witness. But it was Van's involvement with Janiyah, the baby mother of Baton Rouge rapper NBA YoungBoy, that set the stage for his final confrontation. In August 2020, Van was photographed spending time with Janiyah, leading to widespread speculation that they had been intimate. This wasn't just about romance. It was about disrespect in the rap game, where sleeping with another man's baby mother is considered one of the ultimate violations. Van's response to the situation was typical of his personality. He couldn't let any perceived disrespect slide, even when the smart move would have been to focus on his career and avoid unnecessary drama. He released songs like Mine Too that directly addressed the situation, essentially claiming that he had been intimate with both women and didn't care about NBA YoungBoy's feelings. The beef escalated when NBA YoungBoy released snippets of songs that seemed to predict Van's death, rapping about killing someone from out of town who was chasing after women. Whether this was intentional foreshadowing or just coincidence, it added another layer of tension to an already volatile situation that was spiraling out of control. On November 5, 2020, Vaughn was in Atlanta performing at a club called Opium. After his show, instead of going back to his hotel, as his security team had planned, Vaughn made a last-minute decision to visit Monaco Hookah Lounge, where Quando Rondo, one of NBA YoungBoy's closest associates, happened to be hanging out with his crew. What happened next was captured on security cameras and would be analyzed frame by frame in the aftermath. Vaughn approached Quando Rondo and immediately began throwing punches, apparently trying to beat him up in front of a crowd of witnesses. This wasn't a planned hit or a calculated move. This was Van acting on pure impulse, letting his emotions override his judgment. But Wando wasn't alone that night. His friend Lulu Tim was nearby, and when he saw his associate being attacked by someone he didn't recognize, he responded with gunfire. Tim shot Vaughn 4 times, mortally wounding the Chicago rapper and setting off a chaotic shootout that left multiple people dead and wounded. The irony of Van's death is almost too perfect to be coincidental. The man who had allegedly killed so many people, who had built his reputation on violence and intimidation, who had survived countless street wars and legal battles, was ultimately killed in a dispute that had nothing to do with the gang politics that had defined his life. King Von died at Grady Hospital in Atlanta on November 6, 2020, at the age of 26. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the rap community and beyond as fans and fellow artists struggled to process the loss of one of drill music's most authentic and talented voices. But Van's death also brought a sense of closure to many people in Chicago who had been affected by his alleged crimes. The immediate aftermath of Van's death was chaotic and violent. His associates from O Block threatened retaliation against NBA YoungBoy's camp, while Quando Rondo and LOL Tim faced their own legal and street consequences for their involvement in the shooting. The cycle of violence that had claimed Van's life showed no signs of stopping, with new threats and counter-threats being posted on social media daily. For Taisha, Van's mother, her son's death was both devastating and financially liberating in ways that highlighted the complex relationship between trauma, survival, and success in America's most dangerous neighborhoods. The same violent stories that had gotten Vaughn killed were now generating millions of dollars in streaming revenue and royalties from his music catalog. Posthumous album releases and merchandise sales ensured that the Bennett family would be financially secure for generations to come. Van's music continued to rack up hundreds of millions of streams, with each play generating revenue that flowed directly to his estate and family members. The irony of this situation cannot be overstated. Taisha, who had worked multiple jobs and struggled to provide for her family after Silk's murder, was now living comfortably off the profits from her son's musical confessions to multiple murders. Van's death had accomplished what his life never could. It had made his mother rich and financially independent. But the financial success came at an unimaginable cost that no amount of money could ever justify. Taisha had lost both her partner and her son to the same streets that now provided for her survival. The Bennett family legacy was written in blood, with each generation paying a higher price for their involvement in Chicago's gang wars. His critics view him as a serial killer who used his platform to glorify violence and inspire others to follow his destructive path. They argue that his music contributed to the cycle of violence that continues to plague Chicago and other urban communities, and that celebrating his life means ignoring the pain of his victims' families. The Bennett family legacy serves as a reminder that in the streets, even kings eventually fall, and the cycle of violence continues long after the original players are gone. Van's music will continue to influence new generations of artists and fans. But his story should also serve as a warning about the ultimate cost of choosing violence over healing, revenge over forgiveness, and street credibility over genuine success.